All right, so you sent over some fascinating stuff for this deep dive. We've got excerpts from Robert Greene's The 50th Law.
Oh, yeah.
And some information on Z Library. I'm really excited to dive in.
Yeah, they're an interesting pairing for sure.
They are. So the 50th Law, for anyone who doesn't know, is this collaboration between Robert Greene
And 50 Cent.
And 50 Cent, the rapper.
Yeah.
And the book's all about fearlessness and power. I think a lot of the excerpts you picked focus on how to be courageous and independent, especially in a world that can feel pretty scary sometimes.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then we've got Z Library, which has been in the news for giving people free access to a ton of books and articles.
It's almost like Z Library was putting Greene's ideas into practice.
Right, kind of taking that idea of independence and applying it to the digital world.
Exactly.
But let's take a step back and look at Greene's main argument about fear. He doesn't say we should never feel fear, does he?
No, not at all. Greene acknowledges that fear definitely serves a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It's a natural response to danger. Like, it's supposed to keep us safe.
Right. It's just like a warning system.
Exactly, yeah. It's a warning system, but it's supposed to be a temporary thing, When we let fear just become this, like, constant state of mind, that's when it really starts to hold us back.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And he makes that point clear with the story about 50 Cent's childhood, which sounds incredibly tough.
It was. I mean, 50 Cent grew up without a father. His mother was murdered when he was just 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
And he had to navigate the dangers of the streets.
Yeah, it sounds like those experiences, Greene kind of argues that those experiences forced 50 Cent to confront fear at a very young age.
Absolutely.
And that he had to develop this fearless persona kind of just to survive.
Yeah, he kind of had to adapt to that environment.
Right.
Yeah.
But it sounds like Greene isn't just talking about surviving those really extreme situations. It sounds like he's talking about having this, like, fearless mindset in everyday life.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
He refers to this as realism. So seeing the world clearly and objectively without letting fear distort our perception.
Okay.
And it's about looking at challenges as opportunities, not roadblocks,
Right. So not letting fear stop you from pursuing things?
Yeah, exactly.
And a great example of this is President Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Great Depression. His famous quote, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Like, that really sums it up perfectly.
Right. And it's such a simple quote.
It is, but it's so powerful.
It's so powerful.
Yeah.
And he didn't just, give this pep talk and walk away. He took action. He actually shifted the entire country's mindset from this kind of panic to action.
He did, yeah. I mean, he really helped people feel like they could actually do something to improve their situation, even in the midst of a crisis. So if we want to be more courageous and independent, where do we start? Greene has this 4-step plan. And the first one kind of surprised me. He says, reclaim dead time. What does that even mean?
It means using those little bits of time that we typically waste, whether it's waiting in line, commuting to work.
Scrolling on our phones.
Exactly. Even just zoning out, right.
Right.
Turning those bits of time into opportunities to learn or strategize.
Mm-hmm.
And a good example he uses is Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Mm-hmm.
When Vanderbilt was a kid, he had to work for his father. And instead of just going through the motions, he used those seemingly unproductive hours to actually learn about the business and how he could do things differently.
Yeah.
So that dead time really became his secret weapon.
So it's like turning your downtime into prime time for personal growth.
Yeah, exactly. Those little chunks of time really add up.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could be useful. So what's the next step in the plan?
So the next step he calls create small empires. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Greene argues that we should always be looking for opportunities to take charge, to develop our skills and confidence by building something of our own, something new.
So does that mean, like, everyone needs to start their own business?
Not necessarily. It could be a side project, a volunteer role, even just taking ownership of a certain task at work and finding ways to just improve it, do it better.
So it's more about having that entrepreneurial mindset.
Yeah, exactly.
Looking for opportunities to kind of create and lead even within larger structures.
Exactly, yeah. Think about 50 Cent. Even though he was working within the music industry, he was always looking for ways to control his own work, his own image, So he was building his own empire within that system.
Okay, and I can see how that would really help build confidence.
Absolutely, it does. And as you gain experience and confidence, you naturally start to kind of climb the food chain, which is Greene's third step.
Okay, that sounds maybe a little ruthless.
It's not about being cutthroat or like stepping on other people to get ahead.
Right.
It's about strategically positioning yourself so you have more control over your work, your life. A good example is Cesare Borgia. He was a very powerful figure in Renaissance Italy, and he was constantly aware of like who had the power, who didn't, and he would make these strategic moves to gain more autonomy and influence.
So it's more about being smart and strategic about your career path and making choices that lead to more independence, more freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah. It's about realizing that you have more choices than you might realize and that you can make decisions that lead you towards a position where you're not as dependent on others.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the final step in the plan?
The final step is to make your project a reflection of your individuality.
Okay.
Greene argues that we should embrace our unique qualities, right, and express them in our work. He uses examples like Miles Davis, who, revolutionized jazz with his own unique style, and John F. Kennedy, whose personality and vision reshaped the political landscape. They weren't afraid to be different, to stand out. Yeah, so it's about finding your own voice, your own style, and not being afraid to let that shine through, which is really powerful, especially in a world that tells us to conform all the time.
Right, exactly. And that's where I think the connection to Z Library starts to become really clear.
Yeah, how so?
Well, I mean, Z Library wasn't just about free access to books. It was about empowering people to learn on their own terms,
Yeah.
to explore whatever they were interested in, regardless of what traditional institutions might consider important.
Yeah, so they're both kind of rejecting this one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah. They're saying, don't let anyone tell you what you should or shouldn't be learning. Go out and discover what interests you, what excites you, what makes you feel alive.
And that takes a lot of courage. It takes, being willing to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's like they're both, Greene and Z Library are encouraging us to become these kind of like intellectual rebels, to carve out our own paths of learning and growth.
And that's where the courage comes in.
Yeah.
We learn to face our fears, to overcome limitations, to embrace the full potential of our minds.
Yeah, this is giving me so much to think about. It's a whole new way of looking at learning and personal growth. But we've only just scratched the surface of Greene's ideas, haven't we?
Oh, yeah, there's so much more.
There's so much more to explore.
But, maybe we should take a little break and come back to this in part 2.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll delve into some of those other key concepts from the 50th Law and see how they connect to the mission of Z Library.
Sounds great. Welcome back to our deep dive into fear and courage.
Before the break, we were talking about Greene's 4-step plan for cultivating courage. And I'm really curious, how do those steps actually connect to this whole idea behind Z Library?
Well, they connect in a really interesting way. Let's start with that first step, reclaiming dead time. Greene really emphasizes using those pockets of wasted time, like those little chunks of time that we all have,
right,
to actually learn and think strategically, just like Cornelius Vanderbilt did when he was young. Remember, he's working for his father, but he used those hours to also learn about the business. So it's like, instead of scrolling through your phone while you're waiting for the train, you could be listening to an audiobook.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Or you could be reading an article about something you want to learn more about. It's about turning that downtime into prime time.
Yeah, and that's kind of like what Z Library was all about, right? Like
right, yeah.
Making knowledge accessible at any time, anywhere.
Right.
So then what about the next step?
So the next step is creating small empires.
Okay.
And this is where we're encouraged to really take initiative, develop our skills, build confidence by actually building something of our own, creating something new.
And like taking ownership.
Exactly.
Okay.
So this could look like volunteering for a leadership role in a community project,
right,
or even just suggesting a new initiative at work.
I feel like it's kind of like those folks who were early adopters of Z Library and started building those huge libraries.
Absolutely.
They were curating these worlds of knowledge.
Right. They saw a need, and they just took the initiative to fill it.
Right.
They created something valuable for themselves and for others.
Yeah, so cool. So what about the next step after that?
So then we start to climb the food chain.
Okay.
This is Greene's third step. And it's all about positioning yourself to have more control over your work and your life.
Okay.
So this could involve, seeking out mentors, taking on more challenging projects that broaden your skill set.
So like Cesar Borgia, who was always making strategic moves to gain more power.
Exactly. Playing the long game.
Yeah. But it doesn't have to be manipulative, right?
Right. It's not about being manipulative or like stepping on other people to get ahead.
Right.
It's more about being mindful of the dynamics and the power dynamics at play and making choices that lead you towards, greater independence and freedom.
Makes sense. And then the final step ties into Z Library in such a powerful way,
Yes.
which is making your project a reflection of your individuality.
Mm-hmm.
So Greene's saying embrace your unique strengths
Yeah.
and express them in your work. He talks about, Miles Davis and John F. Kennedy, like bringing something new to whatever field you're in.
Absolutely. And Z Library was all about that as well, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Like they didn't tell you what you should learn. It was all about letting individuals create their own library.
Their own unique paths.
Yeah, their own paths of exploration. It's kind of like a rebellion against the traditional ways of learning.
Absolutely. And that takes courage, right? It takes a willingness to challenge the norms
Yeah.
and to step outside of what's considered safe or acceptable. I mean, this really resonates with me personally, actually.
Really?
Yeah. Remember when I was like hesitant to switch fields
Mm-hmm.
and everyone told me I was crazy,
Yeah.
but I felt so drawn to it. And taking that leap has been one of the most rewarding decisions I've ever made.
That's awesome.
It was really scary at first, though. I'll admit that.
Well, you were basically living out Greene's philosophy before you even knew it.
Yeah.
That's so cool. But Greene doesn't stop there, right? There's also this idea of calculated momentum.
Right. So this is where adaptability and a willingness to experiment come in. It's about being able to adjust to those changing circumstances, to embrace, the fluidity of life,
Right.
and not get stuck in these rigid patterns.
Right.
A good example is Leonardo da Vinci.
Oh, okay.
He was constantly exploring all these different fields, and his diverse interests really fueled his creativity.
I mean, another great example is 50 Cent. Like,
Right.
He's not just a musician. He's got business ventures. He acts. He's always evolving.
He's a perfect example.
It makes me wonder if being comfortable with change is a key part of building courage.
I think you're right. When we're so afraid of making a mistake or going in the wrong direction, we can end up stuck,
Yeah.
never reaching our full potential.
That's true. But if we embrace that fluidity, like you did when you switched fields,
Mm-hmm.
it can open up so many possibilities.
It does, yeah. And it brings us to another key element that I think both Greene and Z Library really emphasize, which is connecting with our environment.
You're talking about Jane Goodall.
Yes.
Like, her immersive approach to studying chimpanzees. She didn't just, observe from afar. She lived among them. She learned their language, their social structures.
She did, and it revolutionized the field of primatology.
And it's a good reminder that true understanding requires more than just detached observation. We have to engage with the world around us, listen deeply, and step outside of our limited perspective.
Right, and it makes me think about how Z Library challenged this traditional way of accessing information. Like traditionally it was controlled by institutions, limited by geography. Z Library made knowledge available to anyone with an internet connection.
Right. It fostered the sense of global connection and shared learning.
Exactly. And in a world that feels increasingly divided, I think that's a really important message.
Yeah, especially with all the algorithms and echo chambers online. Like, it can be so easy to get stuck in your little bubble and only see information that confirms what you already believe.
Right.
But, like, if we actually want to grow, we have to actively seek out those diverse perspectives and engage with people who hold different views.
Absolutely. That's where real growth happens.
It's like Greene's idea of mastering your craft.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how developing true expertise requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to even embrace boredom.
Right. And a good example of this is Isaac Newton.
Oh, yeah.
Who basically used his time during the plague when everyone else was, consumed by fear to delve deeper into his studies. He made these groundbreaking discoveries.
And it just goes to show that sometimes the most profound growth happens when we're forced to slow down,
Yeah.
to step away from distractions and really focus.
Absolutely. And it kind of reminds me of how Z Library became such a refuge for so many during the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
When access to libraries and other resources was really limited, people turned to Z Library to continue learning.
Yeah.
It became a lifeline.
That's incredible. It shows how resilient the human spirit is.
It does, yeah.
Even in the face of adversity. But Greene also stresses the importance of testing our ideas in the real world.
Yes.
Like learning by doing. He uses the boxer, Jack Johnson.
Oh, yeah, I love that example.
As an example.
Yeah, he would deliberately prolong his fight so he could study his opponents.
He was like fearless. He wasn't afraid to get hit.
Right, and sometimes we have to get out of our heads and get into the arena, so to speak. Be willing to experiment, take risks, learn from our failures.
Yeah, it's in those moments that we discover our true strength. And that leads to the idea of embracing mortality, which is one of the most profound, yeah, but challenging ideas in the 50th Law. Like, it can be a little uncomfortable to think about,
It can.
But Greene says it can actually be a source of strength and clarity.
Exactly, yeah. He uses Hemingway's near-death experience as an example. Remember when Hemingway almost died in World War I?
Yeah.
He described it as feeling his soul leave his body and then return.
Wow.
And that experience completely changed him. It stripped away all those superficial concerns.
Right.
And left him with this deep appreciation for life.
So it's not about being morbid. It's about using that awareness to live more fully and intentionally.
Right.
Like recognizing that our time is limited and making choices that really align with what matters most to us.
Exactly, yeah. And it brings us full circle to the mission of Z Library, which was ultimately about empowering people to live more meaningful lives through access to knowledge and the freedom to choose their own path.
Yeah. This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
It has.
But before we wrap up, there's one more idea from the 50th Law that I think we should explore.
Okay.
The concept of appropriation.
Ah, yeah.
Something we've kind of touched on throughout this discussion.
We have.
But I think it deserves a little more attention.
Yeah, I agree.
What do you think?
Absolutely. It's a key concept, and I think it can be really easily misunderstood. But when you grasp its true meaning, it can be incredibly liberating.
Okay, so let's dive into that in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore what appropriation really means and how we can use it to kind of unlock our full potential and become the architects of our own destinies.
Sounds great.
Welcome back to our depth dive.
I feel like this has been the fastest deep dive ever.
It has gone by quickly. In this last part, we're going to explore this really intriguing concept from the 50th Law.
Oh, yeah.
Appropriation.
That's a good one.
And it's something that I think can be easily misunderstood.
It can, yeah.
People hear the word and they think like stealing or taking credit for someone else's work.
Right, yeah, that's not quite it.
But it's so much deeper than that.
It is. Greene uses appropriation to describe like a mindset almost, a way of being in the world that's all about taking ownership of your own development.
Okay, so it's about like actively seeking out the knowledge and experiences you need,
Yeah.
and then actually shaping them into something that's uniquely your own.
Exactly, yeah. Think of it like this. Imagine you're a chef, right?
Okay.
You're creating this new dish.
Mm-hmm.
You might start with a traditional recipe, but then you add your own twist,
Right.
like different ingredients, maybe a new technique.
A little flair.
Yeah, your own personal flair.
So you're not just copying,
Yeah.
you're transforming it into something new.
Exactly. And that's what appropriation is about. It's taking those raw materials, knowledge, experience, and molding them into something that reflects you, your individuality, your vision.
That's such a good analogy, the chef one. It makes me think of those amazing libraries that people created on Z Library. They weren't just downloading books, they were curating, they were sharing their passions, they were building these really incredible resources that reflected their own unique interests.
Right. They saw this vast sea of information and you're like, I'm going to take this and make something new.
Right, and something awesome that reflects me. And in doing so, they were embodying this whole spirit of appropriation. They were taking ownership of their learning. So how can we apply this concept of appropriation in our own lives? It can feel kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming if you think of it as this big, grand thing. But you can start small.
Right.
Just think about what you're interested in, your goals.
Mm-hmm.
What knowledge or skills do you actually need to achieve them? And then go out and seek those resources. Don't be passive.
So instead of just passively consuming information,
Right.
you should be actively searching for what you need, what resonates with you.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Try new things, combine different ideas, see what sparks your creativity,
Like, be playful with it.
Yeah, be playful, be curious, Don't take yourself too seriously.
Right. And remember what we were talking about earlier, the whole idea of calculated momentum?
Yes.
Like, that applies here too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Be willing to just try things, to make mistakes, to learn as you go.
It's like we're all artists.
Yeah.
Creating these masterpieces from the raw materials of knowledge.
But the more we practice this art of appropriation, the more confident and courageous we become, right?
Right, because we're not relying on other people to tell us what to think anymore. We're taking ownership. We're becoming the architects of our own destinies, you know?
Yeah, and that's such a powerful feeling. And all the tools that we've talked about throughout this entire deep dive, reclaiming dead time, creating small empires, climbing the food chain, embracing our individuality, making our projects a reflection of ourselves, like these are all tools that help us become more courageous.
Absolutely.
More independent, more fulfilled.
And those tools are available to everyone.
Right.
It doesn't matter your background, your education.
Yeah, it's really about your willingness to learn and grow and embrace the journey.
That's it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to reflect on what you've heard.
Yeah. What resonated?
What insights are you going to take with you?
What actions are you going to take?
Yeah, because the power to create a more courageous and fulfilling life is within your grasp.
It is. So dare to unlock it.
And dare to share it with the world.